phenomenon exists, it really precludes doing any kind of ambitious or reasonable work looking at mechanisms. And the data is not clear. Does intercessory prayer actually influence positive health outcomes? We're just not certain. Let's assume that it does influence positive health outcomes. There is still no accepted biomedical explanation for IP's alleged healing effects. There's very little data, for example, in, say, the Bird study or the Harris study where there were positive findings. We have the outcomes, but we don't have any of the pathways. We don't have any of the physiological data that may indicate that there are shifts within these people that would help justify why, in fact, they had a better course. So we're lacking data. IP's healing effects, if they do exist, appear to be non-local. So are the mechanisms naturalistic? Is there some latent force or energy that's actually being tapped through IP that influences healing? And perhaps there is something that exists and science just simply isn't able to measure it yet or to verify it in a way that would satisfy mainstream science. Perhaps the mechanisms are supernatural. Perhaps it is God who underlies the benefits of prayer, but can God be tested? We would also have to consider that if prayer can indeed provide positive effects, then are there nocebo effects or are there negative effects that could come from prayer? There's data that indicates approximately 5% of people at least admit that they pray for harm for someone else, that something befalls, some negative consequence befalls someone else. So if there's a positive and potentially negative consequence to prayer, what does that mean in terms of our own ethics about subjecting patients to an intervention that may actually harm them? There is a range of methodological criticism directed at trials, the standards of which seem to be at times somewhat higher than the criticism that's levied towards more traditional kinds of medical research, but it's out there. That studies essentially lack scientific rigor with a number of problems depending on what the study may be. There's also an argument that we cannot have true controls in these studies because there's no way to control for off-protocol prayer. Humans are likely to be prayed for by family or friends as well as receiving the intercessory prayer. We certainly can't ask people to not be prayed for. So can we really actually capture the effects of additional intercessory prayer? And there's also a range of criticism relative to potential confounds to the IP effects that have to do with the human subjects themselves, saying that any effects of IP actually have to do with psychologic factors or social factors inherent in being human, or potentially placebo effects. So I decided to do my study for a couple of reasons. One being is one way to begin to counter some of those criticisms. And as I was reflecting on this whole issue, I thought about how useful an animal model would be to control for example, human confounds, to help control for off-protocol prayer, even though there are some individuals who pray for healing and well-being of all life on the planet. Those people are fewer than the individuals who would be praying for humans only. And so a non-human primate model in particular provides an interesting parallel for us to take a look at the effects of IP, but again, offering for a variety of controls. Also controlled access to data. Animals always show up for their lab appointments, it seems. So. It can be challenging, though, to find a comparable disorder, one we find in animals, that we can compare to humans. Self-injurious behavior is one of those disorders. Self-injurious behavior refers to a potentially severe form of behavioral pathology. It's often found in subgroups of primates, captive primates. It can consist of a variety of behaviors like hair plucking, for example, over-grooming to the point of creating new wounds or perhaps aggravating existing wounds. There seems to be a psychologic component. So the etiology of this disorder appears to be found in primates who have been subjected to particularly adverse early experiences and have a variety of stressful experiences across their life. And there are similarities between SIB in primates and obsessive-compulsive disorder in humans. We can see people who perhaps engage in aggressive, repetitive hand washing, and they can actually end up creating wounds on their hands. SIB is believed related to serotonergic system dysregulation. It's thought that there is too little serotonin centrally. We see that in obsessive-compulsive disorder in people as well. There's also data to suggest that there's HPA axis dysregulation that's occurring too. Some data suggesting too high levels of glucocorticoids, particularly cortisol. Other data suggesting that it may be too little, low levels. What are the therapies for treating self-injurious behavior? Increasing the central levels of serotonin, particularly through the administration of a particular class of antidepressants, SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. You'd know it as Paxil, Prozac, that class of antidepressants. It works in people. It also works in primate. However, there are many animal labs, primate labs, who are too small and don't have the funding to be able to afford SSRI therapy. It's really quite expensive. So an alternative that's been used is oral L-tryptophan. It's a dietary component. It's taken orally with the thought that central levels of serotonin would increase and in turn change the consequent behavior or reduce the self-injurious behavior. Wound healing is a complex biological process. It occurs across 3 nonlinear phases. The first phase is inflammation, significant for blood clotting and migration of a variety of immune cells to the wound site. The second is proliferation and granulation tissue formation. There is new tissue that's formed. It's temporary tissue. It's viable but temporary to seal the wound, creating a new epidermal surface. And tissue remodeling with the goal of actually getting the tissue back to the original structure and function. There are a number of factors that come into play across these 3 processes, these 3 phases, such as the immune system, growth factors, chemoattractants, cytokines, and oxygen is also very important. Not initially, a hypoxic environment helps promote healing, but oxygen is needed later on in the process. It's also important to consider psychological stress, in large part because of the HPA axis and the hormonal cascade I made reference to earlier, because that dysregulates many aspects of the body, including the immune system, and definitely influences negatively the phases of the wound healing process. So in addition to creating this study to address some of the criticisms that were levied, there were 3 other purposes to this study. One was to assess the effectiveness of IP on wound healing. The second, to assess the effects of IP on self-injurious behavior. And the last was to monitor a variety of physiological data, some blood data, some data relative to the immune system, and also levels of cortisol. So we had a snapshot of the neuroendocrine system, all of which relate to wound healing. The animals were garnet bush babies. They're prosimian primates. They're small, relatively easy to handle. They're about 2.5 pounds depending on the sex. They are nocturnal and provide the benefits of a true primate model. 22 animals were used. They were resident at the Jackson State University Center for Prosimian Studies, ranging in age from 2 to 15 years. They were allowed to free feed. Nothing changed in terms of their behavior throughout the study. And they were maintained on a 12-12 light-dark cycle with dark onset at 8 a.m. so that they were active when we were active coming into the lab. We measured wound area and severity, some blood measures, red blood cell data, including the count of red blood cells. We took a look at levels of hemoglobin, which is the protein that assists in the transport of oxygen throughout the body, hematocrit to take a look at the proportion of red blood cells and the volume of blood we were looking at. Mean corpuscular volume, was there changes in the size of the red blood cell? What happened to the amount of hemoglobin that the individual cells were carrying? There were a variety of leukocyte levels, white blood cells that were assessed, and again, plasma cortisol. I was also interested in behavior. I wanted to see what happened with these animals grooming. So they were videotaped for 15-minute intervals, both AM and PM counterbalanced, so that we were able to achieve some representative sampling across time. There were two variables of interest to me. Wound grooming specifically, I want